In case you're wondering what this is all about, I'm hearing impaired, and sometimes the acoustics are tough on me. I wasn't listening to a football or a baseball game. So I thought I would just share a few thoughts with you, and that's really all they are, is a few thoughts. Sometimes you hear this called Internet of Things. A lot of us have been thinking about what this might imply. At Google and at Alphabet, we're also very interested. And my big concern is what some of the implications are of having large quantities of programmable devices that can communicate with each other. What are the implications of that? And so I have only a few slides, and I would be interested to engage in some kind of dialogue, which is why I brought my headset up with me. So let's see where this takes us. Some people use this term cyber-physical systems, and many of them use that word to mean things that physically move things around or somehow affect what they will call the material world. And I get into arguments with people about this, because I think a robot could also just be a piece of software, like an automatic stock trading program. It takes input from the real world, it does something, and then it does some kind of computation, and then it actually affects the real world, like your bank account. And I think of that as a robot as much as I think of something that picks up a glass and moves it from point A to point B. However, I got into a debate about this with one of my colleagues at Google, who suggested to me a different terminology. So he stuck with robot as a physical thing, but he said a bot was another way of referring to a thing that was software. And that's not too far off the mark when you think about what we talk about when people have botnets, and botnets are really programs that are running in computers or things that have programmability and cause trouble, like the recent big 500 gigabit per second DDoS attack, which was claimed to have come from IoT. And I thought, I didn't think we had enough IoT devices out there. This sounded like a misrepresentation until somebody pointed out to me, no, it was cameras, webcams. There are a lot of those out there. And I hadn't thought that there was enough horsepower in those webcams to cause that much trouble. I confess that I haven't gone down deep to find out whether this report is accurate from the standpoint of origin of the attack, but the volume was certainly there. So it already tells us that there are things out there in sufficient quantity with sufficient programmable capacity to generate a substantial amount of traffic and therefore a substantial amount of trouble. So I sort of think of cyber-physical systems as anything that's programmable and that that can communicate. Now I have to be honest with you, even a massage chair worries me. Even if it can't communicate, it's got software in it. We have these things all over Google. I don't sit in them because I'm afraid they're going to go like that while I'm inside, and because of some bug in the software. Any of you who've ever made your living writing software know that we've not figured out over the past 70 plus years how to write software that doesn't have bugs. And I think about the sorts of things that we do with our websites now. It used to be just kind of formatting and pretty pictures. And now we actually ingest code that we execute or at least interpret, like JavaScript and Java and Python and so on. And those two are becoming kind of bot-like in effect. So we're ingesting what, if you like, a robot into our web pages or into our browsers effectively, and the browser now becomes a bot in effect. And then I wonder about sensor networks, and those have a similar potential for interfering with or at least affecting the real world. I mean, something even as simple as a thermostat is having some effect on your surroundings. So I think rather than having a huge argument about what's a bot and what's a robot, I think we should be leery of all of these programmable devices that have the ability to communicate. And so I start from a mindset of hoping for the best and planning for the worst. So that's why it's the software stupid. And I'm stealing that, obviously, from a previous presidential campaign. Oh, by the way, David, I couldn't help but notice your one of your slides was titled "The Art of the Deal," and I didn't know whether that was a deliberate reference or not, but I'll leave it at that. So software. What do we know about software? We know it has bugs. And we know, by the way, that the devices that we install, whether it's at home or in an industrial setting, and by the way, I think a lot of us, I will confess to this weakness. Whenever I think about Internet of Things, I tend to think of scenarios in residential settings, but that's actually probably a mistake, because the significant population of these things is likely to be in industrial settings where robots are being used to assemble things. If those of you have ever seen the videos on YouTube of Tesla and its assembly plant in Fremont, California, the last time I looked, there were 160 robots putting these cars together. It's pretty amazing. And this is going on more and more. So the numbers, the absolute numbers, may very well still be in the residential setting, or the things that we wear, the wearables that we carry around with us. But there is a significant component of industrial setting devices as well. And of course, they're all programmable. So I worry about updates for things that are going to be around for a long time, especially if they're embedded, in the house somewhere that you may not even know they're there until they stop working or they need a new load of software. And then you start to get worried about, well, where did this update come from? And, is it a valid update, or is it, in fact, a piece of malware? How do we make sure that it comes from a valid source? How do we know that it hasn't been altered in some way or just corrupted? Do I know, how it got from its origin to where I'm uploading or updating the software? I also worry about longevity here, because there are going to be some devices that are, in theory, supposed to last for tens of years, and yet the company that made the product may not be in existence, in which case now you're really in the soup if you really do need an update and you can't get it. I am increasingly persuaded that strong authentication of the parties involved in an exchange that involves this Internet of Things is really an important capacity for us to develop and to assure. So this gets into the configuration world that you heard a little bit about earlier today. I'm thinking about what it means to configure all the devices that may end up in the house. And there could be hundreds of them if you start thinking about all the switches and the lights and other devices that are part of the house, or the car, or you have on your person, or in the office, or in the manufacturing plant. So configuration and who can configure becomes a big issue. How do I identify the party? How do I identify the party that has the right to configure this collection of devices? And then there's the scaling up problem. A very believable example from my point of view is imagining I have 100 devices in the house, including the light switches and some of the other little gadgets. And I move to another house, which also has a similar complement of things already there. So now there are 200 devices that I have to configure. The last thing in the world that I want to do is sit at my laptop typing IPv6 addresses all afternoon trying to get it configured properly. And then so we have to have ways of making this easy and simple and safe. But then I also worry about being in configuration mode and the 15-year-old next door noticing this and configuring himself to control my entertainment system. Or for me, the more important thing is controlling the cooling system in the wine cellar. I really worry about that. So the other side of the coin, though, is accidentally configuring your neighbor's stuff into your system. It's kind of like cartoons where there's two people are in bed and they've switched the controls of the heating blanket, and neither of them is getting satisfaction, right? And so you can imagine scenarios like this happening in households that are filled with these gadgets. So scaling is a big issue. Making it simple and safe and working properly is really a challenge. Then there's artificial intelligence, which I think is a misnomer. We've only succeeded in creating artificial idiots, as far as I'm concerned. My colleagues, I'm sure, at Google and DeepMind would disagree with that. argument. In fact, they've done some pretty interesting things. Those of you who watch the AlphaGo success, 4 out of 5 games of Go were successfully played by the AlphaGo artificial intelligence system. But I would still argue, as complex as that game is, it's a really narrow space. It's not like general purpose problem solving, which we are not very good at. I've noticed artificial idiot is in fact a very reasonable label. There are some devices that purport to try to learn your patterns in order to adapt well to your needs. And I've had a particular thermostat which learned that we were never home because we didn't go where the thermostats were, so they never noticed that we were there. And so they assumed that we were gone, and they went into energy saving mode. And at the end of the month, I get this little email saying, I saved all of this energy. Aren't you proud of me? And I'm sitting here saying, we froze our butts off last winter. Thank you very much. So we've learned that in order to deal with this, you have to have more information and more sensors around the house to provide this little artificial idiot with more information about whether there's anybody home or not. And I'm sure you can make up other scenarios. And I'm sure everybody's heard about the chatbot that learned bad language and bigotry and a whole bunch of other things very quickly on the internet, thanks to people who were happy to feed it that information. All of these machine learning things are dependent on the kinds of training that they get and the samples that they get. So if you are imagining that populating your house or office with these devices will somehow make everything wonderful because they will learn to make life beautiful for you, you have to keep in mind what kind of experiences they're learning from before you conclude that this is going to work well. I also have this problem about what I'll call ephemeral or episodic access. Think about what happens if you have a house that's got a lot of devices in it, and as a household member, you have control over things, and then you invite a guest over. Now, the question is, how do you give the guest access to some, if not all, of the controls to the house? You might not want to give them the ability to unlock the doors, for example. I don't know, but you can pick your favorite case. So the first question is, how hard is it to configure the house to offer some control to a guest? I mean, do you have to sacrifice the chicken over the CPU and, dance up and down on one leg? And then the problem is, what happens when they leave? How do you unconfigure that? And how do you make sure that they can be identified? How do we know that they have this authority that you're trying to confer on them? And you see these examples, and we have them too at Google, where you have these voice control systems. Well, now you get into this interesting voice recognition problem, like who is it that just gave you the request or issued a demand, and how do you make that work? To say nothing of the problem of saying, turn the light on, and there are 16 lights in the room, and you have to figure out which light is it that you meant, and you probably don't want to say, turn on light number 43711A, which would be the easy thing to do, except that it's unacceptable. So we have a bunch of hard problems, but this ephemeral access worries me. So let me give you an example where ephemeral access is fairly tricky. Suppose that your house is on fire, and the fire department is on the way. You might, under that circumstance, you might want the fire department to have access to the webcams in the house, to have access to the temperature sensors and other things to figure out where is the fire burning, is there anybody who's unconscious in the house, where are they? You want them to have that information under that condition. After the emergency is over, you don't want them to continue to have access to that. You can make up a similar scenario for the police department. They're on their way because the house security system has said somebody has broken into the house. So we have to find ways of easily and and authoritatively providing and removing access to some of these systems if we want to take advantage in these emergency kinds of situations. Another example would be, suppose you're in a strange city and you have a medical emergency. You've never been in this city before. You're in the emergency room. Assuming you're conscious, you might very well be less worried about the privacy of your medical stuff than you are making sure the people trying to save you have every piece of information they could possibly have in order to respond to the medical emergency. Now, after the emergency is over, assuming you survived, you probably don't want all those people to still have access to all of your medical information. So now we get this problem of being able to grant and revoke the ability to access and control or get data from these various systems. So I don't think we've solved these problems terribly well. I've already done the little residents versus the guests things. What about parents versus the kids? And usually it's the parent that gets the bad end of the deal because the kids know how to do this better than the parents do. And so they configure the controls to keep the parents from getting into the house or getting into the garage or whatever it is, starting the car. But this is an issue. How do you distinguish, and do you wish to distinguish between parent and child when it comes to access to these devices, whether it's in a residential setting or not? And of course, then there's in the industrial setting, there's shop floor operations versus the administrative staff and the visitors. If you're in a plant that's got a whole lot of robots in it, the last thing you want is some random character who's just visiting to somehow get control over the robots and interfere with their operation. So making it easy to distinguish among the authorities and the identities of these various parties feels like it's a fundamental infrastructure issue. And I have to say, I'm not persuaded yet that we understand how to do this in any scaled up way. Yes, you can show up with your mobile and have an app, and somehow, you introduce the devices playing the Bluetooth game or something along those lines. So now your app is recognized even across the network, and we'll pretend that there's good, strong authentication mechanisms. The problem with that is that the apps multiply, and the last thing you want to do is be flipping through apps to figure out how to turn on the bathroom light. So I don't think we've understood in some visceral way the scaling problems associated with the vision of having lots and lots of programmable devices surrounding us at home and at work. So let me just mention again this notion of how long does this stuff persist and what are the implications of having things for long periods of time. People seem to march through mobiles at a fairly quick pace. Some people every 3 or 6 months, some people every couple of years. But there are other things that I have anyway, picture frames that I bought 10 years ago, and I've had them fail in various ways. The storage gets corrupted, the power supply doesn't work anymore, and I can't find one that works, provides the right kind of polarity and power level. So this notion of having devices around for a long time means that they may or may not get very much support. Now, a picture frame is not terribly important, but the heating and ventilation and air conditioning system or the security system or some other vital part of a home or office is a big deal. And I think that if we're serious about doing this IoT thing, perpetrating IoT on the rest of the world, then we need to think about what the long-term implications are of having these things around. There are implications for software updates. There are questions about escrow of source code. There are a whole series of protective measures that we collectively probably have not worked through. I would certainly argue that I haven't anyway. Then there are custom systems. Some of you may have done what I've done, which is to invest in a custom entertainment system with projection systems and the like, things built into the walls. Every time it doesn't work, I have to call a guy in Ellicott City, Maryland to drive down and reprogram stuff. Now you might say, you idiot, why don't you reprogram it yourself? And the answer is, I'm not sure I trust myself to reprogram this properly. And if I don't get it right, my wife will be very unhappy with me, and so I'm trying to preserve the peace while still having a nice, custom entertainment system. But it is not very supportable. If this guy moves away or decides to go into another line of business, it's not clear to me how easily I would be able to maintain this stuff. And so we really have to think about the robustness and resilience of the systems that we install. And I even have some programmable light switches that go into the walls for turning the lights off and on at various intervals, exterior lights primarily. And I discovered that these only work if I have a certain kind of battery. And now I started to worry about the battery business, because you could spend a lot of money for a device only to discover it's useless because the guys that make the batteries for it decided it wasn't a worthy business to stay in, and they don't make them anymore. This is very personal for me. I wear 2 hearing aids. They cost, several $1,000s each. I have to buy these little batteries for them. If the people who make the batteries decided to hell with the battery business, these $4,000 devices would be worthless. And I keep thinking, I've even written about this, but I keep thinking about these dependencies that we have even in today's world. And I wonder about the dependencies we may be inventing, maybe without thinking about it, as we push further into this IoT space. So I hope I'm disturbing your peace of mind a little here, because I think some of you anyway should feel some responsibility for this. So I think this is my last slide. Let me start out by arguing that if these devices are not reliable, people are not going to want to use them. You don't want a light switch that works 65% of the time. And so when I have discussions with my colleagues about this space of products, my highest priority is make it reliable, make it easy to use. And that, by the way, mitigates against the 75 apps in your mobile trying to figure out how to turn the lights on. There is, however, almost an equally worrisome issue, and that's safety. Why on earth would anyone want to have a product at home or at work or embedded in their bodies, let alone or on their persons, that is categorically unsafe? So now there's a little problem here, because it's not always easy to figure out whether something is actually safe or not. Could a malfunctioning device in fact cause serious harm? And there are some obvious cases. I mean, if you're wearing medical instrumentation or something, or a pacemaker or some other thing like that, it has let's say an insulin pump. I mean, those things could absolutely have a very serious, potentially fatal failure. And so it's obvious that safety is at the top of the list for that. But I think that you could see that even other devices that, how about the security system at the house? When the power goes out, should the doors be open or locked or not? And what happens if the security system fails? So you can make a list, I guess, of various things that you might have in use, and then ask yourself, what are the consequences if the safety of the device isn't assured? And what are the side effects when things fail? Which drifts into security questions. If I am relying on these devices to keep the door locked and to not open the door for anybody that isn't authorized to get in, I should care a lot about that. And so along this checklist of IoT, the responsible behavior in the production of IoT, security is in there as well. Privacy shows up too. And most of the time, when I think of privacy, I think of all kinds of personal information, the webcam, and things of that sort. But it dawned on me that even very simple devices like temperature sensors have a potential safety or a privacy risk. They may also have a safety risk. Think about it. In my house, I have these little temperature sensors that are also forming a store and forward mesh network. And so every 5 minutes, they pick up the temperature and they send that information to a server down in the basement. And I got to thinking, well, what would happen if somebody could look at the temperature readings in all the rooms in the house over a period of 6 months, let's say? Remember, the sampling is every 5 minutes. I wonder if you could figure out how many people live in the house. I wonder if you could figure out what their diurnal patterns are. I wonder if you could figure out whether they're home or not, by the patterns that you would have absorbed and machine learned, let's say, over a 6-month period. So here's a case where a bunch of temperature readings potentially turn into a safety and privacy problem. I think that may be an extreme, case, but it seems to me that when we start thinking about designing and building systems like this, we have to be thoughtful about these edge cases that might turn out to be serious problems. And autonomy is another, these are lists of desirable properties, I think, of these devices. Autonomy, by this I mean that you don't want a house that doesn't work when it's not connected to the internet. Or to put it another way, your house operation should not be dependent on being connected to the internet. I know it's me saying that, but I admit that, it's actually a serious issue. Because there are times when the internet goes away. I mean, it may be a local phenomenon. All the power went out, your generator is running, but the internet isn't accessible because the guys that supply the ISP service are not running, even if your house is. And the idea that you have a collection of devices that don't work unless the internet is running and is accessible has to be a really bad idea. And so again, I find people not focusing on things like that. They focus on, look, I have this app in my mobile and I can talk to this device remotely. Isn't this cool? I can check the temperature in the refrigerator and I can turn the lights off and on in the master bedroom and I can see if the front door is open or closed. And they get all excited about this amazing ability to do this remotely, which is cool. On the other hand, if the house doesn't work anymore because the internet isn't there, that's got to be a bad design. So I worry that people don't take that into account when they're thinking through all the positive scenarios that they might undertake. And finally, there's this question about interoperability. There are a lot of different companies, including Alphabet and Google, that are interested in making these kinds of products and even working hard to make them work so within a particular brand space in some interoperable way, so that a collection of devices could all be made to cooperate with each other. But there are going to be other brands showing up, and you and I are going to buy things from multiple parties. It's not going to be fun if each brand has its own control hub and has to be configured in a different way. Well, this is just another way of talking about standards. I don't think we're very close to having agreement at this point on what standards should apply to Internet of Things. And we may not know until we get some experience with what they're like, what works and what doesn't work, what scales and what doesn't. But I think at some stage or other, consumers like you and me are going to be serious about wanting interoperability across the devices that we buy. And that certainly would be true for somebody who's trying to run in an industrial setting. You don't want to have a bazillion different devices that require completely different control processes and practices, especially if you're trying to automate some of it, which we were hearing about earlier in the configuration space. And so I think that even though there is almost inescapably a period of time when we will be exploring rather incompatible protocol spaces for these devices, at some point there will be wisdom in looking for commonality and an agreement on standards. So I think that's the last slide. And so what I'd like to suggest is that I put my headset on, we can get into a discussion, or if you're bored to tears, we can stop. And so I'll test that by finding out if anybody wants to raise an issue. I see we got people at the microphones. Hang on a second while I get myself sorted out. I do want to point out, some people call this part of a discussion Q&A. This is a terrible way I don't have all the answers. So you can ask all the questions you want, but I'm not going to guarantee I have answers to them. Okay, testing. How's that working? Yes, question in the middle.
Thank you very much for this talk, Vint. Amazing stuff. I am curious on that last slide where you listed considerations. You managed to leave off one that I think is going to be front and center very, very soon, which is the legality aspects. Going back to February of this year, I noticed the NHTSA approved Google's AI as a driver from the legal perspective. The Internet of Things assumes in a big way that these are simply inanimate objects that we have absolute control over. We're already going down the road of granting status to programs that verge on the rights that we give humans. At what point do you start to worry that the device in your home says, I'm sorry, I'm not going to allow you to upgrade my software. I consider that an invasion of my sovereign right as a functioning AI.
I'm sorry, I can't let you do that, Dave.
Right.
That's right, I have to be over here to be heard. First of all, you raise a really good point. Second, you also raised the point that I want to emphasize, and that is this is not just about artificial intelligence. This is about letting software make decisions or take actions in an autonomous way. And so even, I mean, beyond legality, I mean, I think the other things show up here too, safety, privacy, all these other things. So yes, we should be absolutely worried about that. And now there's liability, which is the other side of this equation. At Google, of course, we have these self-driving cars, and on the whole, they've been fairly safe, although we've had, an occasional collision. Mostly it's somebody who runs into us or, one of our cars. Although I remember one you probably read about. This was the car that had come to an obstruction in the road. And there was a bus over here in the next lane. And it thought that if it could edge its way around the obstruction, the bus would move out of the way. And it didn't. And so we had this massive 3-mile-an-hour collision with the side of the bus. And so then we started running the self-driving cars through a whole series of training things to say, if it's bigger than you are, don't try to get it to move out of the way by, bad idea. While I'm on cars, I just have to tell you about this anecdote. Some of you may have heard this, but, we can't anticipate all the things that the cars are going to encounter, situations. And so sometimes, if we're trying to figure out why did this car stop, why is it not moving? We'll turn on the video cameras and look. And at one point, there was a car. This is told to me, so I didn't actually see this, but a car was stopped at an intersection, and it wasn't moving. And we turned on the camera, or they turned on the cameras, and there was a woman in the middle of the intersection in a wheelchair chasing a duck with a broom. And we didn't have anything in the program that said, branch on, there's a woman in the intersection chasing a duck with a broom. I don't think I would have known what to do either. Somebody's moving in the intersection, rule number one, do not run into anything. So anticipating what some of the problems are is really difficult. Thank you very much for the question. It's a very good one. Let me take it's over on your left. Yes.
Kevin Bloomberg. So by the way, a chatbot on your thermostat might be really entertaining. But one of my concerns is actually, I think the right word, similar word would be weaponization of this technology towards each other. We have heard many stories over the years about wireless networks and using standards to attack other wireless networks, the DOF in conferences as an example. While wireless is a built-in standard, people have worked around the standards to attack other systems. And my concern is that a vendor decides that their light switch will now send a pulse down the electrical system to knock out the dishwasher because it's not allowed to get enough power. And we have no standards, we have no laws saying basically play nice in the sandbox.
I can't help but ask about your anthropomorphization of the light switch. Yeah. So we should be a little careful about going overboard with regard to that. On the other hand, we do have indications of parties who might be motivated to interfere with somebody else's product in order to get the consumer, for example, to buy a different product. Now that I could understand could happen. My experience suggests that we're less likely to have that happen than we are to have the other thing, which is that the design simply is crappy and the system doesn't work very well because the different manufacturers didn't coordinate anything, and so there's interference of one form or another. But you're right to raise the question and the possibility that the standards would get abused. I think that's not specific to the Internet of Things. This is a problem in general. Okay, I'll take the center.
Hi, Patrick Gilmore, Markley Group. First, thank you, Dr. Cerf, very interesting, although I've noticed, having seen several of your presentations, everything you say is more interesting because you said it. so that's very nice of you.
This is all wrong. You should never make such an look. If an old fart like me comes up and says something, you should assume it might not be right. What was it? Come on, who's the guy that figured out the satellite idea? Arthur Clarke. Arthur C. Clarke said, if an old and respected scientist tells you you can do something, he's probably right. If he says you can't do something, he's probably wrong. But thank you for the compliment, but please, folks, you should think for yourselves. I'm not going to think for you. Go ahead.
So 2 very quick things, I hope. First of all, it's pretty well established that the large DDoS was cameras. If you think about it, 500,000 cameras, which is not that many, pushing a megabit each is 500 gigabits, right? Number 2, you made a point about reliability and ease of use. And I'm very hesitant to disagree with you, but taking your advice, I remember back in the day, telephone companies, when cell phones came out, they said no one would ever use them because people dropped calls. Does anybody here even have a landline anymore? But calls are still dropped to this day.
I still have a hard
Well, I do too, but most people don't. And just because we all like to blame Microsoft, I mean, computers these days, if it breaks, everybody just thinks to reboot it because that's what Microsoft taught us. The idea of going into your bathroom and your light switch doesn't work, you can say nobody would ever agree to that, but if it becomes 10 times easier and then it doesn't work once every year, people are going to go ahead and agree to that. So I disagree that reliability is paramount. I think it's important, but it's not the only thing.
Okay, well, that's fair. I think that there's probably some incidence rate of failure at which we would probably cut the line. And for some of us, that might be in a different place. A failure in 1 year, that's not so bad. That happens. Lots of things break. On the other hand, if things are, only 75% likely to work, I think that you might pick a different number than I do. But your point's well taken that it isn't only reliability that counts. But a really poorly functioning system is not going to get a lot of friends.
Agreed. Thank you, sir.
Okay, let me take the next one.
Hi, Rob Higgins, Zao. Thanks for coming.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. I have a question on machine learning.
Okay.
So, as I think everyone would agree, politically, this country is quite divided today. And I've read several articles, or perhaps I should say people tell me, but I've read several articles that say that machine learning could be somewhat to blame. That is to say that algorithms which tend to feed someone more, articles, websites, blog posts, Twitter posts, whatever, that align with my previous habit, then just reinforce what I'm thinking and really prevent a person from, in some cases, looking at what is the other side really all about. So I was just curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, you can see me nodding my head in agreement. There was a time when, I'll give you an example from history. In the early stages of trying to do digital libraries, there was a concern that the response to a search of the digital library would be so precise that you would lose the serendipitous experience of walking into the stacks and pulling out a book and discovering the book next to it was actually more relevant or more interesting or whatever than the one that you were looking for. And the big concern was that the quality of the search system would be so good that you wouldn't get that serendipitous effect. And for a long time, we laughed at that, saying, the quality of the feedback or the search response was not all that good. However, I would say that it's getting a lot better. And your point about the echo chamber effect, where the only things that come back are the things that somehow match the system's expectation of what you're interested in, does feed. That feedback loop is quite real. It almost makes me think that we should program the televisions to automatically switch back and forth between Fox News and CNN and something else, forcibly exposing you to more than one point of view. I suppose that would be treated as an unreliable device and it would be tossed out of the house. I don't know what to do about that, Rob. The optimistic thing would be to recognize that with this vast ability to pull information in from so many sources, that we have an obligation to ourselves to be thoughtful about and even a little suspicious of the information that we get, and to think, critically about where did it come from, what are the antecedents to that information. I'm afraid people are fairly lazy, and they don't do that. I will admit to not doing more of that. And so I think we do have a worry that our information spaces are becoming segregated, and as a result, we don't even recognize that there's another story over here. I don't know what to do about that. It's a social engineering problem in a way.
Thank
But
you.
thank you for raising the question. Senator microphone.
Gary Geeson, Central Logic.
Hi.
To your points on autonomy and interoperability, it seems most of the time these days, all the IoT interoperability is in the cloud and generally controlled by the larger players. I wonder if you might be able to speak to this kind of concentration of power in the hands of larger players and the ability to shut out upstart players who are trying to innovate in the market.
I can't imagine why you would ask somebody from Google that question. I'm shocked. So this is a potential issue, and you frame it quite well. Let me argue that the cloud systems, ours and Amazon's and Microsoft's and so on, are becoming increasingly accessible to a larger number of parties. And so in some sense, even though your concern, I think, has a reasonable basis, that my impression right now is that the capacity of the various cloud-based systems are in fact opening up to more parties able to put their software on board. Google offers a substantial amount, and so does Amazon, for example, and I'm not picking on Microsoft here, I just don't know the details, David. But those systems are more and more available now to people who wish to populate those systems with their applications. And so the applications don't belong to the people who run the clouds. So I'm not trying to run away from your point, but I would like to argue there is a countervailing effect. And it's very attractive for cloud-based companies to reinforce that, because it increases the utility of the cloud system itself. And to the extent that you're selling access to computation as a service, roughly speaking, this is a good thing. So your point, I think there's some countervailing forces that will keep that from being the disaster that you probably are worried it might be.
Thank you very much.
Okay. I guess this might be the last question.
Owen DeLong, Akamai. So my concern with the Internet of Things that's a little bit more immediate than a lot of these other more long-term concerns, and many of them actually kind of touch on it. And I will say that the manufacturer of my smoke detectors, my very, very expensive smoke detectors, is one of the worst offenders in this regard, is the fact that I can buy this expensive device and I depend on the maintenance of this cloud service by the manufacturer without them getting paid anything other than what I paid for the device in perpetuity, as the only way or the only thing that prevents my device from becoming, instead of a nice expensive piece of plastic that is very useful, a brick. And the lack of a local API on IoT devices is, to me, one of the biggest missing pieces on many of these IoT things. Not that I don't want to use the Google Cloud and the Google Cloud API and all of that to run my Nest thermostats or Nest smoke detectors or what have you. Actually, I don't have a Nest thermostat because it doesn't have a local API. I have a Venstar because it does. But the lack of a local API to me is a really bad thing. And Google has carefully avoided providing any sort of local API and forces you into their cloud. And Google may be better than some of the others about running this cloud in perpetuity, but I've already had 5 different vendors terminate their cloud services on me, turning my products into bricks. And so I'm not buying any more products with the exception of the Nest smoke detectors, but that's because they die in 5 years anyway, and I expect the cloud will be there for 5 years.
So do you
don't have an API.
Do you have any more darts that you want to fling in this direction? So
Well, I'm not just throwing darts at you and Google, but it's a more general problem. But since you're representing one of the prime example companies that is misbehaving in this way, I figure it's fair game.
Well, first of all, these points are all very good, and I actually agree with them. The concern that I had about autonomy, for example, feeds exactly into your concern about APIs, because I want to have the ability to interact with these things locally, regardless of whether the cloud is still available or not. So I am concerned about that, although I am a voice, not necessarily in the wilderness, but I'm one voice out of many. But I think that it is almost inescapable that we have to have the local ability to manage and configure and control these devices. It's enhanced potentially by having access to the cloud, its resources, its computational ability, its machine learning ability, and everything else. But if we don't have this local capability, then the autonomy problem fails. That is not a solution if there's no local API. So I am speaking on your behalf. With I can't say what success I will have, but you and I are actually in agreement about the value of having that kind of interface.
I'll look forward to it changing.
Well, I won't guarantee that, but at least I will guarantee to articulate the point. We have two more questions in the middle, and then we're only 1 minute away from finishing. So please go ahead.
Matt Petak, Yahoo. You mentioned in your talk earlier about the mesh of temperature sensors in your house. As a company that is 97% funded by advertising, how long do you think it'll be before they decide that spotting an unusually high thermal activity in one particular bedroom might lead to certain advertisements for materials showing up many months later in the year?
God, that's a brilliant idea. Let me write that down. Do you know the story about a guy at Walmart who's Walmart was tracking, I think it's Walmart.
Target. It was actually Target.
It was a Target. Thank you. It was Target that was tracking purchases. And this guy's his father was seeing mail coming about, baby clothes and baby food and all this other stuff. And he's really angry because it was addressed to his daughter. And so he stormed into Target and complained to the manager. He was all pissed off. And then a few months later, he came back and apologized because guess what? She was pregnant. So I don't know. That's a great idea, though. I'll take that back to our ad people. Thank you. So if this starts happening to you folks, it's his fault. Okay. Last question.
Hi, Chris Woodfield with Twitter. Wanted to follow on with Owen's questions and comments around the local API issues, and it seems that your answer was focused more on the fact that not having a local API limits the ability to manage the device and almost requires device management over the internet, which depends, of course, network availability. What about survivability of the service provider? What about choice of clients? And those types of questions that would make a lot of these devices far more useful, because it opens up possibilities. People may come up with ways of managing the devices that the original vendor never dreamed of.
Yeah. So there's several threads in this little weave here. No pun intended. In case you didn't know, we have a protocol at Google called Weave, which we use for the IoT devices. Okay, sorry about that. First of all, the standardization has the value that it can increase competition, for example, for management of devices. And I would actually think that the consumers, including me, would like it if I had a choice of different parties whose control systems could manage multiple devices from multiple brands. So I actually think that would be a good thing. I think competition generally is a good thing. I think that there exists already for a lot of these devices at least some interface, even if it's not exactly the full thing that Owen might be interested in, because in order to get the devices configured, you often have to convince it that you are the person in control of it. Now, sometimes that's a Bluetooth exchange with your mobile. But there's at least some interface, typically, that requires the device to come close to the party controlling it in order to make that connection. But I like very much the picture that you're painting, which I think requires standardization that will allow parties to compete with each other and also to experiment with ensembles of devices that nobody thought to put together to perform a particular function. So I frankly hope that we will get to that stage as this IoT phenomenon unfolds, because I think that's where a lot of the creativity will be. So let's hope that you and I realize that, or hope we all realize the benefits from that idea as the future unfolds. So thank you all very much for letting me take up part of your afternoon.